The first thing Rose Bennett heard after becoming a married woman was the sound of her husband walking away from her. Not shouting, not anger, not even an unkind word. Just the slow scrape of his boots across the cabin floor, the opening of the front door, and then silence as Mason Hale stepped outside into the cold Colorado night. Rose sat frozen on the edge of the narrow bed. Her wedding dress was still on. A lantern burned beside her, its flame bending whenever the mountain wind found a crack in the log walls. She had expected many things from the man she had married that morning. Coldness, perhaps. Regret. Maybe even contempt. But she had not expected him to leave. For several minutes, Rose stared at the closed door. Then she looked down at her hands. They were trembling. By midnight, the tears came. She pressed her face into the pillow so Mason would not hear her from wherever he had gone. What Rose did not know was that Mason Hale had not walked away because he did not want his new bride. He had walked away because years earlier, another woman had stood in that same room. And Mason had made himself a promise beside her grave that he had never told another living soul. 2 days earlier, Rose had still been Rose Bennett, the oldest daughter of a failing wheat farmer outside a little town called Red Hollow. Her family had once owned enough land to feed themselves and sell what remained. Then came drought. Then insects. Then debt. By early autumn, the Bennett barn held more empty stalls than animals. Her father, Samuel, had begun cutting firewood for neighboring farms to earn a few coins. Her mother repaired dresses by candlelight until her fingers swelled. Rose's 2 younger sisters had stopped asking whether there would be meat for supper. They already knew the answer. Rose knew something else too. The bank would take their farm before winter if her father could not pay what he owed. Then Reverend Cole arrived one evening with a proposal no one in the family expected. Mason Hale, a rancher from the high country, wanted a wife. He was willing to settle Samuel Bennett's debt as part of the marriage agreement. Rose's mother went pale. Her father refused immediately. But Rose had heard Mason's name before. Everyone in Red Hollow had. People said he lived alone beyond Black Pine Pass. Some claimed he had once nearly killed a man during a cattle dispute. Others said his first wife had died because he refused to bring her down from the mountains during a winter storm. A shopkeeper's wife whispered that Mason had not smiled in 6 years. No one seemed to know which stories were true. That did not stop anyone from repeating them. Rose spent that night listening to her parents argue quietly in the kitchen. Her father said he would rather lose the farm. Her mother asked where they would go after that. Rose remained awake until sunrise. By breakfast, she had made her decision. I'll marry him. Her father's spoon dropped against his plate. No. Rose met his eyes. You taught me that family means carrying weight when it becomes too heavy for someone else. This isn't carrying weight. Samuel stood so quickly his chair scraped backward. This is giving yourself away. Rose swallowed. Then let me choose what I give. Her mother began crying. Rose nearly changed her mind. Nearly. Then she looked toward the pantry, where half a sack of flour rested on the bottom shelf. That small sight ended the argument inside her. 3 days later, she stood inside Red Hollow's little white church, wearing her mother's altered wedding gown. There were no flowers, except a handful of dried lavender Reverend Cole's wife had tied near the pulpit. No musicians. No celebration. Yet nearly every pew was full. People had not come for Rose. They had come to see Mason Hale. He stood near the altar in a dark brown coat, with dust still clinging to his boots. He was taller than Rose expected. His black hair was slightly too long. A short beard covered his jaw. He carried himself like a man used to rough weather and long distances. But what Rose noticed most were his eyes. They were not hard. They were tired. When she entered the church, he looked at her only once before lowering his gaze. Whispers moved through the pews. Rose heard pieces of them. Too young. Poor thing. She'll be back before spring. Another woman murmured something about Mason's dead wife. Rose kept walking. During the ceremony, Mason answered every question clearly. He did not hesitate. When Reverend Cole asked whether he would protect and honor Rose Bennett for as long as they both lived, Mason said, "I will." His voice was low and steady. Afterward, Rose expected him to take her hand. He did not. He simply stepped aside so she could say goodbye to her family. Her father held her longer than usual. Then he leaned close enough that only she could hear him. "If you ever want to come home, you come, debt or no debt." Rose nodded quickly before her courage could break. Outside the church, Mason had already prepared 2 horses. He strapped her small trunk behind his saddle and checked the girth on her mare twice. Rose noticed something unexpected. He was careful. Not nervous. Careful. When she mounted, he asked, "Are you comfortable?" "Yes." "If the pace is too hard, tell me." Those were almost the only words he spoke for the first hour. Red Hollow disappeared behind them. Open plains turned into rising hills. By late afternoon, pine forests had swallowed the road. Rose tried to understand the man riding ahead of her. He never looked impatient. Never rushed her horse. Whenever the trail narrowed, he slowed. When they crossed a rocky creek, he dismounted and walked beside her mare until they reached firm ground again. Nothing about him matched the frightening stories. That made Rose more uneasy, not less. A cruel man would have been easier to understand. A quiet, thoughtful one forced her to wonder what everyone had been hiding. Near sunset, the temperature dropped sharply. Rose rubbed her hands together. Mason noticed. Without speaking, he removed a thick wool coat tied behind his saddle and held it toward her. "What about you?" she asked. "I'll manage." "You'll be cold." "I've been cold before." She took the coat. It smelled faintly of smoke, leather, and cedar. They camped beneath a wall of pine trees that night. Mason heated beans, sliced bread, and poured coffee. After supper, he spread a bedroll beneath a canvas shelter for Rose. Then he placed his own blanket beside the fire. Rose frowned. "You aren't sleeping in there." "No. There is room." Mason looked at the flames. "Not enough for you to feel comfortable." She stared at him. That answer followed her into sleep. The next day they crossed Black Pine Pass. By dusk, the land opened into a wide mountain valley. Rose saw a barn, fenced pasture, and orchard, and a solid log cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. It looked nothing like the lonely wilderness shack she had imagined. Mason stopped his horse. "That's home." Rose studied the valley. Then she asked the question that had been with her since the church. "Why does everyone in Red Hollow speak about you like they're afraid?" Mason's jaw tightened. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he answered, "Because fear asks fewer questions than truth." Then he rode ahead. That evening after supper, Mason showed Rose the bedroom. Fresh sheets covered the bed. A small vase of dried mountain flowers rested beside the window. Rose turned toward him. "Where will you sleep?" "The barns." Her chest tightened. "Why?" Mason looked at her as though searching for words he had avoided for years. But he did not answer. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and placed something small on the table. A carved wooden horse. It had been polished smooth from years of handling. 2 tiny initials were cut beneath its belly. LH. Rose looked up. Who is LH? For the first time since she had met him, Mason's face changed. The color seemed to leave it. He picked up the carving carefully. His thumb moved over the initials. Then he whispered, "Someone I couldn't save." Before Rose could ask another question, he walked out into the night. And several hours later, when Rose finally cried into her pillow, it was no longer because she feared Mason Hale. It was because she had begun to suspect that the most frightening thing in his life was not what he might do to her. It was what had already been done to him. Rose woke before dawn to the sound of an axe striking wood. For a few seconds, she lay still beneath the quilt, listening. The cabin was cold except for the orange glow of dying coals in the fireplace. Outside, Mason worked in the gray morning light as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. Rose sat up slowly. The carved wooden horse was still on the table. LH. Someone I couldn't save. Those words had followed her through every hour of restless sleep. When she stepped outside, Mason was splitting logs beside the barn. Frost covered the grass. His breath showed white in the air. He noticed her immediately. "You're up early." "So are you." "I usually am." Rose wrapped her shawl tighter. "Who was LH?" The axe stopped halfway toward the chopping block. Mason lowered it. For a moment, Rose thought he might walk away again. Instead, he looked toward a cottonwood tree standing beyond the orchard. "Come with me." They crossed the yard in silence. As they neared the tree, Rose saw two small stone markers beneath its branches. One was larger than the other. Mason stopped several feet away. Rose read the first name. Sarah Hale. The second marker carried a name that made her chest tighten. Lucy Hale. Rose looked toward Mason. "Your wife?" He nodded. "And Lucy?" "My daughter." The morning wind moved through the cottonwood leaves. Rose stared at the little grave. "How old was she?" 5. Mason's voice barely carried. Rose remembered the wooden horse. "You carved it for her?" Another nod. She wanted to ask what happened. The question felt cruel. Mason seemed to understand anyway. It was 7 winters ago. He stared at the graves instead of Rose. Sarah became sick during a storm. Fever came fast. Roads disappeared under snow before sunrise. Rose said nothing. "I rode for the doctor." His hands curled at his sides. "Took me most of a day to reach town. By the time we returned, the pass was nearly buried." He swallowed. "The doctor did everything he could." Rose understood what came next before Mason said it. "Sarah died that night." His voice cracked almost invisibly. "Lucy got sick 2 days later." Rose lowered her eyes. "I buried both of them before the snow melted." The story struck harder because Mason did not dramatize it. He simply stood there beneath the tree, carrying 7 years of grief as quietly as he carried everything else. "I'm sorry," Rose whispered. Mason nodded once. Then he turned toward the barn. That was all. But Rose understood something important. His silence was not emptiness. It was a place filled with things he could barely survive remembering. Later that morning, a wagon came rattling down the valley road. The driver was a broad, gray-haired man with a weathered face and a smile that appeared before he even climbed down. Mason Hale married and didn't send word. Mason looked almost embarrassed. "Morning, Ezra." The man laughed. "That's all I get." Then he turned toward Rose and removed his hat. "You must be Rose." She smiled. "I am. Ezra Boone. I own the spread south of the ridge, though Mason here has repaired enough of my fences to claim half of it." Mason gave him a flat look. Ezra laughed harder. Rose liked him immediately. While Mason unloaded 2 sacks of grain from the wagon, Ezra leaned closer. Settling in. I'm trying. His expression softened. I suppose Red Hollow told you all kinds of things. Rose hesitated. They did. Ezra glanced toward Mason. Most folks there know his name better than they know the man. Rose looked toward the graves. Mason told me about Sarah and Lucy. Ezra's smile faded. Then he trusts you more than he trusts most people. Rose was surprised. He barely speaks to me. That is Mason speaking. She almost laughed. Then Ezra lowered his voice. People blamed him after they died. Rose turned serious. Why? Because grief makes people uncomfortable. Rumors make them feel clever. He looked toward the ridge. There was a newspaper story. Said Mason ignored warnings. Said he should have taken Sarah to town sooner. Was that true? No. Ezra answered immediately. He rode through a storm that would have killed most men just to bring back a doctor. Rose felt anger rise. Then why didn't anyone correct it? Some tried. Ezra rubbed his jaw. But lies spread faster. Before Rose could ask more, Mason returned. Ezra changed the subject. By noon, the wagon was gone. Rose spent the afternoon cleaning the small storage room behind the kitchen. It had been unused for years. Dust covered an old trunk near the wall. She wiped the lid and opened it. Inside were children's clothes, carefully folded beneath a faded blanket. A tiny red mitten rested on top. Rose froze. She should close the trunk. Instead, her hand hovered above the mitten. There was something devastating about how carefully everything had been preserved. Not abandoned. Preserved. She heard the door behind her. Mason stood there. Rose immediately stepped back. I'm sorry, I didn't know. His eyes moved to the trunk. For several seconds, neither spoke. I haven't opened that in years, he said. I can put everything back. No. He entered slowly. Mason picked up the little mitten. His thumb moved across the worn wool. Lucy hated these. Rose looked at him. Why? She said red made her hands look like tomatoes. Rose laughed before she could stop herself. The sound surprised both of them. Then Mason smiled. It was small. Almost painful. But real. Rose suddenly understood why people said he never smiled. Perhaps he had forgotten how. He placed the mitten back inside. She talked enough for both of us. I think I would have liked her. You would have. Their eyes met. Something shifted between them. Not love. Not yet. But perhaps trust taking its first careful step. That evening, Rose cooked supper. The biscuits came out too hard. Mason ate 2 anyway. You don't have to pretend they're good, she said. I've eaten worse. She narrowed her eyes. That is not a compliment. I meant it kindly. Rose laughed again. This time Mason's smile lasted longer. For the first time since leaving Red Hollow, she did not feel like a woman who had been traded to a stranger. She felt like she might someday belong here. After supper, Mason reached for his coat. Rose frowned. Where are you going? The barns. You don't have to. His hand stopped on the door latch. Rose's heartbeat quickened. I know why you stayed away last night. Mason turned. Do you? You thought I was afraid. You weren't. Maybe. She looked at him steadily. But I'm less afraid now. Mason said nothing. Rose continued. I'm not asking you to stay in this room. She glanced toward the small chair near the fireplace. But you don't need to sleep beside horses just to prove you're a decent man. Something softened in his face. He removed his coat. Then he sat in the chair. Rose returned to the bedroom. Neither spoke again. But sometime after midnight, Rose woke and looked toward the doorway. Mason was still sitting beside the fire, asleep with his head tilted against the wall. He had stayed. Not close enough to frighten her. Not far enough to make her feel abandoned. The sight brought a strange warmth to her chest. The next morning, that warmth disappeared. A rider came hard through the valley just after sunrise. The horse was lathered with sweat. Mason stepped outside as the stranger dismounted. Rose followed. The rider handed Mason a folded document. County notice. Mason opened it. His expression changed instantly. Rose had never seen fear on his face before. "What is it?" she asked. Mason did not answer. Rose took one step closer. Across the top of the paper were the words, "Notice of land claim dispute." Below them was a name Rose recognized from Red Hollow. Victor Langford, one of the richest cattle buyers in the territory. Mason folded the paper slowly. Rose looked at him. "What does he want?" Mason's jaw hardened. "My ranch." The rider mounted again and disappeared down the road. Rose stared toward the mountain ridge. "Why now?" Mason looked at the document in his hand. "That's what worries me." That afternoon, Ezra returned with news that made the answer even more dangerous. Men working beyond Black Pine Pass had found signs of silver. And according to the survey map, the richest vein might run directly beneath Mason Hale's land. If this part of Rose and Mason's story has you wondering who can truly be trusted, stay with them. The truth buried beneath that mountain was about to uncover an older lie as well. Rose looked toward Mason. For years, Red Hollow had called him dangerous. Now, for the first time, she wondered whether someone had needed the town to believe exactly that. By noon, Rose understood that the silver beneath Black Pine Ridge was only part of the danger. The deeper problem had begun years before anyone knew the mountain held anything valuable. Ezra Boone sat at Mason's kitchen table with his hat beside his elbow. A folded survey map lay between them. Rose stood near the stove while Mason studied the paper without speaking. Ezra pointed toward a dark line running across the northern edge of the ranch. Victor Langford has been buying land around this valley for almost 3 years. Mason looked up. "I know." Rose turned toward him. "You knew." "I knew he wanted land." "You knew about the silver." "No." Ezra shook his head. Neither did most folks, but Langford had men surveying these hills long before the official survey started. Rose moved closer to the table. "Then why is he challenging Mason's claim?" Ezra's expression hardened. "Because buying this ranch would cost him a fortune. Taking it through a legal dispute might cost him almost nothing." Mason folded the map. "He'll have to prove the land isn't mine." Ezra gave him a troubled look. "That may be exactly what he's planning." Mason's eyes narrowed. Ezra reached inside his coat and removed another paper. "The county office says someone filed an older deed." Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Older than Mason's." "Supposedly." Mason took the document. His face remained calm, but Rose had learned to notice the small signs. The tightening of his jaw. The way his thumb pressed against the edge of the paper. The silence that came when he was worried. "Is it real?" she asked. "No." His answer came immediately. "My father bought this valley 28 years ago. I have the original deed." "Where?" Mason looked toward the bedroom. "In a lockbox." He stood and disappeared into the cabin. Rose followed. Mason pulled an iron box from beneath a floorboard and unlocked it. Inside were tax receipts, old contracts, cattle records, and a yellowed land deed. He unfolded it across the bed. Rose noticed a signature near the bottom. Jonathan Hale, Mason's father. Everything seemed proper. Then Rose noticed something else inside the box. A newspaper clipping. She recognized the date. 7 years earlier. The year Sarah and Lucy died. Mason reached for the deed, but Rose carefully picked up the clipping. It was another story about him. The headline accused Mason of reckless judgment during the winter storm. Rose read the first paragraph. Then the second. Her anger returned. At the bottom of the page, in small print, appeared the name of the paper's financial backer. Langford Mercantile Company. Rose stared at it. Mason. He looked over. She handed him the paper. Victor's family funded the newspaper. Mason read the line. Something dark passed across his expression. Ezra stepped into the doorway. I was afraid you'd find that. Rose turned. You knew. Not then. Ezra rubbed his forehead. I learned a few years later that Langford's father owned part of the paper. Victor took control after he died. Rose looked from Ezra to Mason. Why would they care about Mason 7 years ago? No one answered. Then Mason slowly sat on the edge of the bed. My father once refused to sell this valley to Langford's father. Rose understood. The land dispute had not begun with silver. The silver had only made an old grudge more valuable. That evening, Rose stood on the porch watching shadows stretch across the pasture. Mason repaired a broken saddle strap near the barn. Everything about him appeared ordinary. That bothered her. A man was trying to take his home. Someone connected to the same family may have helped destroy his reputation years earlier. Yet Mason was fixing leather as though tomorrow would come exactly as yesterday had. Rose walked toward him. You're going to fight this. Mason did not look up. I'll answer the claim. That isn't what I meant. His hand stopped. Rose. For 7 years, people have believed something terrible about you because you refused to defend yourself. I didn't care what they believed. I do. He finally looked at her. Rose's voice softened. You may not need their respect, Mason, but if their lies can now be used to steal this ranch, silence isn't protecting you anymore. He stood. This isn't your fight. Rose felt the words strike harder than he intended. She stepped back. Mason saw it immediately. I didn't mean it that way. Then how did you mean it? He struggled for an answer. Rose waited. At last he said, You didn't marry me to inherit my troubles. Rose stared at him. No, I married you because my family was hungry. The truth sat between them. Neither looked away. Rose continued. I came here believing I had traded my future for theirs. Her voice trembled slightly. But every day since then, you've given me a choice. You gave me space. You gave me kindness. You never treated me like something you purchased. Mason lowered his eyes. Rose stepped closer. So don't decide now that I have no right to stand beside you. For several seconds, Mason could not speak. Then he nodded. All right. It was only 2 words. To Rose, they meant more than any speech. The following morning, she rode to Red Hollow. Mason wanted to accompany her. Rose refused. If people are going to tell me the truth, they may speak more freely without you standing beside me. He disliked the idea. She could see it. Before she mounted, Mason checked her saddle twice. Then he handed her his small revolver. Rose stared at it. I don't know how to use this. You don't need to. Then why give it to me? So anyone who sees it wonders if you do. Despite everything, Rose smiled. That almost sounded clever. It was clever. She laughed and rode away. Red Hollow looked different when she returned. The same stores lined the dusty street. The same church bell hung over the square. But Rose no longer saw a town filled with people who knew Mason Hale. She saw a town filled with people who had decided they knew him. Her first stop was Dr. Henry Whittaker's office. He was nearly 70 now, with white hair and hands that shook slightly when he poured coffee. When Rose mentioned Sarah Hale, the cup stopped halfway to the table. I wondered when someone would finally ask. Rose leaned forward. Tell me what happened. Dr. Whittaker looked toward the window. Mason came for me during the worst storm I'd seen in 20 years. He rode all the way from the ranch. Nearly killed himself doing it. The doctor closed his eyes briefly. His horse collapsed outside town. He took another and brought me back. Could Sarah have survived if he had brought her sooner? No. The answer was firm. She was already terribly sick before the snow began. Rose swallowed. And Lucy? Same fever. Dr. Whittaker looked at her sadly. Mason did everything a husband and father could do. Then why didn't you say that when the newspaper blamed him? Shame crossed the old man's face. I did. Rose frowned. I gave a statement. He opened an old cabinet and searched through a stack of papers. Finally, he removed a faded handwritten page. This is the copy. Rose read it. The doctor's statement clearly said Mason had acted bravely and without delay. Yet none of it had appeared in the newspaper. Who received the original? Dr. Whittaker answered quietly. The editor. Who worked for Langford. The doctor nodded. Rose left with a signed copy. Her next stop was Reverend Cole. Then the blacksmith. Then an elderly widow named Margaret Pike. Each person gave her another piece of the same story. Mason had repaired Margaret's roof after her husband died. He had paid for medicine for a ranch hand's son. He had carried food through winter snow to families trapped outside town. He had never asked anyone to mention those things. By sunset, Rose had collected 6 written statements. But the most important discovery waited at the county record's office. The clerk, a nervous young man named Thomas Bell, examined the deed Langford had filed. He compared it with Mason's original record. Then his face changed. Mrs. Hale. What? This document couldn't have been signed on the date written here. Rose's heart began pounding. Why not? Thomas pointed to the name of the county recorder who had supposedly witnessed it. Because this man died 11 months before this deed was signed. Rose stared at the paper. The land claim was not merely questionable. It was built on a false document. Thomas lowered his voice. If Langford knows this paper is false, he's in serious trouble. Outside, daylight was fading. Rose tucked copies of the records safely inside her coat. She should have stayed in town until morning. Instead, she thought of Mason waiting at the ranch. For 7 years, he had carried lies alone. She wanted him to know that one of them had finally broken. Rose mounted and started toward Black Pine Pass. She had ridden less than a mile when she heard another horse behind her. At first, she assumed it was a traveler. Then she heard it getting closer. Fast. Rose glanced over her shoulder. A rider in a dark coat was following her. She urged her mare forward. The rider followed. By the time Rose reached the first line of pine trees, there was no longer any doubt. Someone knew what she had found. and they did not want those papers reaching Mason. If you believe Rose was right to stand beside a man the whole town had judged, stay with this story, because her ride home was about to force Mason Hale to face the one fear he had never learned to bury. Rose gripped the reins and pushed her horse toward the mountain trail. Behind her, hoofbeats thundered closer. Rose did not look back again. She leaned low over her mare and followed the narrow trail climbing toward Black Pine Pass. The papers inside her coat suddenly felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. Dr. Whitaker's statement, the county records, the proof that Victor Langford's land claim had been built on a document signed by a man who was already dead. Behind her, the hoofbeats came closer. Rose's mare stumbled over loose stone. Easy, girl. She tightened the reins. The trail ahead divided near an abandoned logging road. Rose remembered Mason pointing it out during their first journey to the ranch. The main trail crossed open ground. The logging road curved through thick pine before joining the valley farther north. Rose turned into the trees. Branches struck her sleeves. The rider followed. Her heart hammered. Then a voice called behind her. Mrs. Hale. Rose recognized it. Thomas Bell, the county clerk. She slowed but did not stop completely. Thomas appeared around the bend, breathing hard. Wait. Rose stared at him. You followed me. I had to. He dismounted quickly. I found something else after you left. Rose remained on her horse. What? Thomas reached into his coat and removed an old ledger page. Victor Langford visited the records office 3 months ago. Rose frowned. So? He asked to see every deed involving Hale property. Thomas looked frightened. The clerk before me made notes whenever someone handled an original record. Victor examined your husband's deed himself. Rose felt cold despite the afternoon sun. Before his own claim appeared. Yes. Thomas held out the page. And there is more. Rose took it. Near the bottom was Victor's signature. He knew exactly what the true deed said, Thomas continued. He could not have believed his claim was genuine. Rose stared at him. Why didn't you tell me this before? I hadn't remembered the ledger. Thomas lowered his eyes. Then someone came into the office after you left asking what documents you'd taken. Who? One of Langford's men. Rose's grip tightened on the reins. Then we ride. They reached the ranch after dark. Mason was waiting beside the front gate. The moment he saw Rose, something in his face broke. He crossed the yard before she had fully dismounted. Where were you? Rose had never heard anger in his voice before. But beneath it was something stronger. Fear. I'm all right. You should have been back hours ago. I found proof. I don't care about the proof. The words stopped her. Mason stood only a few feet away, breathing hard. I thought something happened to you. Rose's expression softened. Mason, I've already waited once for someone I loved to come home. Silence fell across the yard. Mason seemed to realize what he had said. He looked away. Rose stepped closer. You said someone you loved. His eyes returned to hers. There was nowhere left for either of them to hide. Mason's voice dropped. I did. Rose slowly reached for his hand. This time he did not pull away. The next morning, they rode into Red Hollow together. Not as the desperate farmer's daughter and the feared mountain rancher who had stood awkwardly before Reverend Cole. As husband and wife. Thomas Bell rode with them. Ezra followed in his wagon carrying Mason's original deed and the witnesses' statements. Word spread before they reached the courthouse. By midday, townspeople crowded the room. Victor Langford arrived in a polished coat, looking more irritated than worried. His attorney argued that Mason's deed contained boundary errors. Thomas placed the county ledger before the judge. Dr. Whitaker gave his statement. Ezra testified that Mason's family had worked the valley for decades. Then Rose stood. Her hands trembled as she held the old newspaper clipping. Victor watched her. Rose looked around the room. Many of the same faces had watched her marry Mason. Many had whispered that she was making a terrible mistake. For years, Rose said, people in this town believed Mason Hale was responsible for the deaths of his wife and daughter. The room became still. The doctor told the newspaper that Mason risked his own life trying to save them. She raised the written statement. His words were never printed. Victor shifted in his chair. Rose placed the clipping beside the county ledger. The newspaper was financed by the Langford family. A murmur moved through the room. Victor stood. This has nothing to do with the land. Rose looked directly at him. It has everything to do with it. The judge ordered him to sit. Rose continued. The same family that helped turn this town against Mason is now asking the court to accept a deed witnessed by a county recorder who had been dead for 11 months. This time the room erupted. The judge struck his gavel. Victor's confidence disappeared. Thomas produced the final ledger showing Victor had inspected Mason's legitimate deed months before filing his claim. There was no dramatic confession. No fistfight. No gun drawn in the street. There did not need to be. The documents told the truth. The judge dismissed Victor's claim and referred the false deed for further investigation. The silver beneath Black Pine Ridge, if there truly was any, remained on Mason Hale's land. Victor left the courthouse through a side door. Nobody followed him. Rose remained beside Mason. One by one, townspeople approached. Some apologized. Others could not find the words. An elderly shopkeeper removed his hat. I repeated things I never knew were true. Mason studied him for a moment, then nodded. I know. The man looked ashamed. Mason did not humiliate him. He did not demand repayment for 7 years of gossip. He simply walked outside. Rose followed. You aren't angry. I was. Went. For a long time. He looked toward the mountains. Then anger became heavier than grief. Rose slipped her hand into his. What will you do now? Mason looked at her. Go home. That evening, they sat beneath the cottonwood tree beside Sarah and Lucy's graves. Mason placed fresh flowers near the stones. Rose set the carved wooden horse beside Lucy's marker. I think this belongs here, she said. Mason looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked it up and returned it to Rose. No. She frowned. Why? I carved it for Lucy. He closed Rose's fingers around it. But I think she'd want someone to keep it inside the house. Rose's eyes filled. Mason looked toward Sarah's grave. I need to tell you why I left the cabin on our wedding night. Rose waited. I wasn't ashamed of you. I know that now. I wasn't disappointed either. His voice grew quieter. That room had been Sarah's. After she died, I slept in the barn for months because I couldn't walk through the doorway without remembering her. Rose squeezed his hand. When you stood there in your wedding dress, I realized I was asking another woman to build a life inside a place where I had stopped living. He swallowed. I was afraid I would make you pay for a grief that belonged to me. Rose wiped a tear from her cheek. So you walked away. I thought giving you distance was kindness. It didn't feel kind that night. A faint smile crossed his face. I know. I cried until morning. I heard you. Rose stared at him. You heard me. Every minute. Why didn't you come inside? Mason looked toward her. Because I had promised myself you would never have to fear that your choices didn't matter. Rose's tears came again. But this time she smiled through them. She finally understood. On her wedding night, she had believed Mason walked away because she meant nothing to him. The truth was almost the opposite. He had walked away because her trust mattered so much that he refused to take even one step she had not invited. Rose leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time in 7 years, Mason Hale sat beside those graves without looking like part of him wished to remain there. Winter came early that year. Snow covered Black Pine Pass. Smoke rose from the Hale chimney each morning. Rose's family visited before Christmas, and Samuel Bennett stood quietly on the porch watching his daughter laugh while Mason carried firewood inside. Later, he found Mason alone near the barn. You kept your word. Mason nodded. Samuel looked through the cabin window at Rose. No. He smiled. You did better than that. Inside, Rose placed the little wooden horse on the shelf above the fireplace. Not hidden in a trunk. Not buried with sorrow. Placed where morning sunlight could touch it. The ranch never forgot Sarah or Lucy. Rose never wanted it to. Love did not erase what had come before. It simply gave grief somewhere gentler to live. Years later, people in Red Hollow still remembered the strange wedding between Rose Bennett and Mason Hale. But the story changed. They no longer told it as the tale of a frightened young bride marrying the coldest rancher in Colorado. They told it as the story of a woman who questioned a town's gossip, and a quiet man who finally learned that opening his heart did not mean betraying the people he had lost. And whenever someone asked Rose why she cried on her wedding night, she would look toward Mason and smile. I cried because I thought my husband had walked away from me. Then she would take his hand. The truth was, he was waiting for me to choose to walk toward him. If this story stayed with you, remember Rose's lesson. Sometimes the person everyone warns you about is simply the person no one ever took the time to understand. If you enjoy emotional stories from the frontier, subscribe and stay close. There are more waiting beyond the next ridge.